Okay, so up to this point, we've been talking about pregnancy purely from baby's point of view, and that's all well and good, but if you've ever worked with a pregnant woman, and I say this as someone whose wife was pregnant, uh, it's important to remember that the mom is also experiencing this, right? It's not just from the baby's perspective, it's obviously mom is undergoing a lot of things here too. So things that are happening to mom are generally unpleasant. It's not a fun time for anybody. We're going to begin very, very early on with some fairly noticeable changes to mom, things that prior to hormonal pregnancy tests that were used for pregnancy tests really prior to that point. Things like Chadwick's sign. So Chadwick's sign occurs fairly early on in the pregnancy as we begin to flood blood into these tissues. They become engorged with blood. And so the vagina itself, internally, as well as the labia outside of it, become sort of swollen and purple. And that's what Chadwick's sign is. We also begin to see later on, not very early in pregnancy, but later on, the breasts themselves tend to get larger. The areolae tend to get darker. They don't always, but they tend to. And we also get what's called melasma, which is an increase in melanin production in face. So the facial skin often becomes a little bit more tan or darker in color. Doesn't always happen, but it does happen fairly commonly. Meanwhile, inside, the uterus is expanding, okay? And we'll see a horrific cartoon in a little bit of what this means. But remember, you've got a developing conceptus in there. It's going to eventually become quite large. And so it occupies a huge amount of space in there, eventually occupying essentially the abdominal cavity. As a result, the stuff that was in the abdominal cavity has to go elsewhere, and it goes up. And so it pushes up on the thorax. The ribs kind of get pushed up and out like you're taking a deep breath, because everything's kind of getting pushed up and getting squished. At the same time, you're kind of changing your center of gravity outward, right? It's moving forward. And so and normally this is where I would stand up and demonstrate this, but thankfully I don't have to do that this term, because it involves me pushing my belly out, my ass backward. But because it's shifting, you kind of shift the way that your lumbar spine goes. You get sort of this excess curvature of it to try to balance yourself over your hips. And so you get lordosis. You remember, hopefully, from AMP1 developing as that. Obviously, weight gain is a part of this. Average of about 28 pounds. It goes up and goes down. You know, different people have different healthy amounts of weight gain. I'm not going to worry about it one way or the other. What is really, really important for us here is to remember that you are developing another person. Right? Will eventually become another person is growing inside of you. Right? And so in order to meet the needs of that developing conceptus as well as your own, we're going to need to include some additional calories in your diet. Somewhere around 300 is an average number. But again, please, if you are pregnant, talk to your OBGYN about this. Don't say, well, Dr. Whitlock said, because Dr. Whitlock is not your OBGYN. Okay, so this is just a rough average number. It's not meant to be a guideline. One thing we have discovered a lot is the importance of folic acid. And so you'll take a prenatal vitamin. You better be taking a prenatal vitamin. I think it's actually illegal not to, believe it or not. That's how important this is. With folic acid in it, so that the developing spinal column develops normally. If you don't have sufficient folic acid, we get spina bifida, a fairly common thing. And spina bifida, so normally, right, so if here's our vertebra, right, here's our centrum, here's our spinal cord. Normally what happens is we get this terrible drawing in here, but this neural arch that comes in and completely covers it over. With spina bifida, what happens is there's a couple of different causes of it. One really common cause of it is where we get some swelling of the spinal cord, and as a result, the two halves of the neural arch never meet. So it's open at the top. That's spina bifida. And there's a host of neurological problems that go with that. The really bad one, anencephaly. This means you are born without a brain or with a really poorly developed brain. Obviously, that will kill you. You're not going to live through that. Or being preterm is another risk factor for this. Okay, so the horrifying diagram that I promised you from before is this one. So here, over here, this is where roughly the occupation of your abdominal cavity, your uterus, exists. By the time that you are 9 months pregnant, it is now all of this, right? And you can imagine all of the stuff that was here is now here, right? It's being pushed up into this space here. Really quite unpleasant. If you remember your diagram from before too, so here's your urethra, here's your urinary bladder, here's your pubic symphysis. Uterus also sits right on top of this, right? So it's also compressing your urinary bladder against your pubic bone. So it's a joke, right? But it's also extremely true that pregnant women have to go to the bathroom all the time, and they are also prone to accidents as a result because they are experiencing tremendous pressure on that urinary bladder. Hormonal changes, in addition to the ones we've already talked about with increase in estrogen and increase in progesterone, we also get HPL, okay, which is human placental lactogen. This is what's responsible for the growth of the breasts, okay? It also is responsible in some ways for parts of fetal growth. We also get glucose sequestration or glucose sparing. Again, another reason, important reason to have a good diet while you're pregnant, because it saves glucose for the fetus from mom. Other hormone levels that are high, parathyroid hormone and vitamin D are both high throughout pregnancy. Parathyroid hormone, you will remember, releases calcium to the bloodstream. Vitamin D is responsible for the absorption of calcium from your diet. This is because conceptus is growing a skeleton, okay, and that calcium has to come from somewhere. This is making sure that you're absorbing it from your diet. It's also removing it from your bones and giving it to the conceptus. Your respiratory system, again, remember this nightmare scenario. All of this stuff is being pushed up, which means your lungs now have like this much space, and get my pen, like this much space to operate. So it becomes very, very hard to breathe. Your tidal volume goes way down. And the farther along in pregnancy you are, the harder it is actually going to be to breathe, which sucks, right? Your cardiovascular system, you have massive increases in cardiac output, 35 to 40%, not particularly uncommon. You're also going to see an increase in blood volume of, again, significant amounts, maybe 25 to 40%. The reason for this, right? If you've never seen a vaginal delivery before, I highly recommend that you experience one before you go through one, because there's a alarming amount of blood involved in those things, right? And most of it is going to be yours. So to safeguard against that, so you don't die, you're just going to have a lot of extra blood. So you can lose a lot and not die, which is great. Yeah, it's just a really large host of unpleasant things that happen to mom. It's not fun, I don't think. I remember being very glad that I was a man going through pregnancy, not a woman going through pregnancy, when that happened to my wife. Okay, so finally the day is here. Parturition, this fancy term for birth, okay? Not to be confused with labor, which is the act of expelling the child. Parturition is labor and all of the other things that go into that. We're going to see in the weeks that lead up to parturition an increase in a protein, surfactant protein, protein A, which leads to an inflammatory response in the cervix, okay? If you remember, right, the cervix is the gateway to the uterus from the vagina or vice versa. And it's muscle, it's relatively stiff and inflexible. It's designed that way, but we got to get a kid somewhere between the size of a loaf of bread and a small watermelon out of it. So as we lead up to that point, we need to kind of get that cervix to relax a little bit. And so surfactant A drives this inflammatory response, helps prepare it to dilate, to get larger so that we can get baby the hell out, which is really, honestly, at this point, all you're thinking about. As much as we like to sit around and say, well, you're due on this day, so on and so forth, you have nothing to do with it. Baby decides when baby's coming out, early, late, whatever. You can induce it, you can have a C-section, but in the absence of those things, baby's making his own or her own choice. And the way that they're making their own choice, okay, is through the secretion of a hormone called cortisol. And cortisol then in turn causes the placenta to up its increase of estrogen, which in turn causes the production of oxytocin and the formation of gap junctions in the muscles of the uterus. All of this, okay, is prep for contractions. Okay, we're preparing the muscles of the uterus to start squeezing that baby out. Now, as this happens, okay, as this begins to build up and so on and so forth, you're going to get false labor, Braxton Hicks. This is you, okay, warming up. Not every woman experiences them, most do, okay? You're getting ready for the process of expelling this child. Again, we already saw some of this stuff here. Fetal oxytocin also in turn causes the production of prostaglandins. Again, both of these are muscle stimulants for the uterus. Again, trying to get it to get moving. Initiation of labor, it begins as the cervix begins to dilate. Okay, as the cervix begins to dilate, we have a feedback loop that causes more and more contraction in the uterus itself, which causes the continued distension or expansion of the cervix, which causes the uterus to contract more. Again, a positive feedback loop on this whole thing. If you want to read more about it here, you can. I'm not, honestly, we don't, it's outside the scope of our course a little bit, but interesting things that are happening here. What I want to talk about here, the last slide here that's of the course in general, is the actual act of parturition. Okay. Assuming your child is arranged in there normally and not breached, the head should be down, pressing up against the cervix. That pressure against that cervix combined with pressure from behind by uterine contractions causes the head to engage the cervical opening, okay? And then we rotate that head to fit the pelvic outlet, okay? At this point, we can talk about the baby crowning. That's maybe a term that you're familiar with. You can begin to see through the distended cervix, through the dilated cervical opening, you can see the top of baby's head. Once this begins, we're at the point of no return. And we're gonna push the head, baby head first out. This is the process of expulsion. Expulsion continues until baby is all the way out. Now, there is one thing that remains behind, that is the placenta. The placenta remains inside the uterus, okay, for half an hour, couple hours, varies from person to person, but it eventually detaches from the uterine wall and is expelled basically in the same way, okay? Now this, you might think, okay, this baby's out, I'm done, I'm free. This is actually potentially pretty dangerous. We get a lot of postpartum bleeding from this detachment stage. It actually is pretty dangerous as far as these things go. And so we worry a lot about bleeding during this stage. Okay, all right. And that is ANP2. So thank you very much for your time, especially with this weird end of semester pandemic response. Look forward to seeing you all again in the fall. If you haven't done so already, please make sure you go in and do the course evaluation. It does even though we've been separated for a couple weeks in spring break, it still is really valuable information for me personally. I like to see what you guys have to say, so please go in and do that for me. Okay, all right. Have a wonderful summer, and hopefully I will see you guys all again